Hello everybody, welcome to this chess tips video, and today's chess tip is to mind your P's and Q's. An old saying that means be on your best behavior or watch what you're doing. And as it refers to chess today, I mean to watch your pawns and the queens. And we know how powerful the queens are and how much they can influence a game, but a lot of us may be guilty of neglecting your pawns. And so this demonstration game today has Judit Polgar with the white pieces, an amazing player, playing, looks like Santos here with the black pieces. All right, and this game begins with e4 and g6. And then d4. So already we see the pawns are being used here to control the center of the board. And so now these pawns are under attack, but this one's protected by the queen for the moment. And after knight to c3, we have d5, using a pawn to fight for the center. But this pawn can just be captured, and at the moment it cannot be recaptured by the queen because this knight is protecting it. So we have another knight developed here attacking this pawn, and the pawn is protected with a bishop. So we see in this game there's a fight around these central pawns, and especially this d5 pawn here. So another knight is developed that will help pile up on this pawn. And white develops a knight also. And finally, this knight moves over here to b6. And so now we have the queen and both knights attacking this pawn. So 3 attackers and only 2 defenders. So this pawn will be recaptured. And now the bishop retreats because it was also under attack here. And castling by both sides. And here, another way pawns can be used is to gain space. So this pawn is pushed forward here to a5, giving black extra space on the queen side, and white does the same. So the pawns are fighting for extra room for their pieces to maneuver here on the queen side. And finally, this pawn is recaptured. So far, both sides are doing good. They're keeping an eye on their pawns. The material is even, and the queens have not moved yet. So as far as watching your queen, one mistake that some beginners make is to bring the queen out too early where it can be attacked. And the queen is so valuable that you do not want to bring it out too early where it can end up in danger and be chased around by pawns or pieces. All right, so white recaptures here, and some pieces are traded. And now we have h3, another way to use your pawns. So this pawn is pushed here to h3. This could leave an escape route for the king if there are any back rank attacks here on the king in the end game or later in the game. But more importantly, this pawn attacks the g4 square, so it prevents this bishop from pinning this knight to the queen. All right, the game continues with c6 being played to guard this knight in the center. So now, if the bishop were to capture this knight, the pawn would just recapture and improve its position from c6 to d5. So the center pawns are more influential, more powerful in the game because they help control this valuable real estate in the center here. So now rook to e1 is played, which keeps an eye on this pawn here on e7 and helps control the center. And rook to e8, also guarding this pawn and maybe fighting for the e-file in the future. All right, bishop to g5 is played, developing this bishop and putting more pressure on this pawn, pinning the pawn to the queen, so this pawn can't move right now. All right, and so both sides are developing their last few pieces that have not been moved out yet from the back rank. So the bishop here eyes the center, this diagonal, keeping an eye on this C pawn possibly. And now the queen is developed here, and we see how the queen just moved up to the second rank. Of course, it could not go further or the bishop would capture, but good players often just bring their queen out to the second or third rank. They don't send their queen out on adventures too far into the center of the board or their opponent's side where the queen may be attacked and chased around the board. All right, now queen to b6 is played here, which keeps an eye on this pawn on d4 here, because the bishop is also attacking that. And if this bishop were to move, the queen could possibly capture here on b2. So now a rook is developed to the center, just adding more protection to the center pawn. So we see how these professional players these masters are protecting their pawns and not letting anything be overwhelmed and captured, not giving away any pawns. All right, so now we have queen to b4 here, attacking white's queen. But Polgar is known as a attacking player and decides to avoid this trade, because if you want to play an attacking game, it's always better to have your queen involved, since the queen is such a powerful piece. So the queen moves here, declining this trade. And now this bishop is moved here to e6. As with the queen and rook and bishop all piling up here, there could be possible issues in the future with pressure building on this e7 pawn here. And now the bishop retreats back to d2 here, chasing this queen away. So that's what I was talking about. You always have to watch out when it comes to your queen, that your opponent might have possibilities of attacking that queen and chasing you around the board. So the queen retreats back to b6, where it still keeps an eye on the center pawn. And now knight to g5 here, attacking this bishop. So the bishop retreats. And if that bishop had not retreated, let's say we have the queen and the bishop eyeing this pawn here, and at the moment nothing is protecting that pawn. But if it were captured with bishop captures on d4, white would have a possibility of attacking and capturing this pawn, or excuse me, this bishop on e6. And if it was recaptured, we have queen capturing with check, and the king would have to move. So black wanted to avoid this position where it would open up his king side. And so instead in the game, of course, we have knight to g5 attacking the bishop. And so the bishop just retreats back out of the range of this knight. All right, now the queen moves a little bit further up the board and threatens with the knight here to capture with check on f7. And so here black decides to block this attack by moving the bishop out. And c4 is played. So white is using the pawns to press forward, gain space, and attack this knight. So instead of retreating immediately, black captures here, and then the bishop recaptures, so this knight is still under attack and now retreats as the bishop and rook were piling up on this pawn, so the knight kind of blocks this attack here. And now c5 is played, once again chasing this queen. So the queen retreats to help keep an eye on this e7 pawn here. And also if the bishop captures the knight and the pawn would recapture, the queen could have captured that extra pawn if this black queen had not been used to help reinforce this diagonal. All right, we have a capture, pawn capture, and now rook capturing, which pulls the bishop up here, because if the queen would have captured, once again, this queen, white's queen, could have captured on f6. So the queen is protecting this pawn. So if we look at the material here, we have 7 pawns for white, 7 for black, and the material is even, but the evaluation gives a +1 advantage to white in this position. And so the pawn is pushed forward. If we go back and look at this pawn, this is known as a backwards pawn. And so this pawn could become weak here. And to get rid of this weakness, it is pushed forward and attacks this c6 pawn. So black ignores this and puts the bishop in between this line of the rook and queen here. And so now we have, instead of a pawn weakness, when this pawn was back here on d4, we have a pawn strength here. The pawn is pushed forward past this c pawn, and now this is a passed pawn because no pawns can stop this pawn from moving forward and queening. The only thing that can prevent this is black's pieces. They must always guard this pawn now to prevent it from pushing up to d8 and becoming a queen. So we have bishop to e6 lining up on white's bishop here, and now the rook moves, putting pressure on this bishop. So if white captures and pawn captures, the rook could jump up here and gain an extra pawn. So the queen moves up here to help prevent this, but now this pawn is weak here and unprotected. So after capture, recapture, and now the queen has captured an extra pawn here. So white goes ahead in material with 7 pawns to 6, and another weakness has been created in black's camp. He has this isolated pawn here that is all by itself, and pawns are very weak when they're isolated, as they have no other pawns beside them that can protect them. If we look at these other pawns, this g6 pawn is protected by the h7 pawn. The same over here. So when pawns are side by side, they can help protect each other, but isolated, they become weak. And another point to look at when you're watching your pawns and trying to prevent weaknesses or use them as for an advantage, we have pawn islands here, which is basically pawns that are side by side. So here we have one island of pawns here. All these pawns are side by side and can protect each other. And here we have another island. All these 4 white pawns side by side. But now if we look at black's pawns, there are 3 pawns here, 2 here, and 1 isolated one. So usually the side with more pawn islands will be weaker and have a tougher time defending those separated pawns, whereas the side with less islands, those pawns can more easily protect each other. All right, moving on, we have rook to e8, helping to protect this isolated pawn. The queen retreats back now and attacks this pawn on a5. And b6 is played, protecting the pawn, but also attacking the c pawn. So the c pawn captures here, And then we have queen capturing, and now white's queen captures. So if we look at the position again, black still has 3 pawn islands to white's 2, but now black has 2 isolated pawns. So 2 very weak pawns here. At the moment, they're protected by the queen, and the rook protects the one on e6, of course. So the queen moves forward here, threatening to attack and capture, attacking and threatening to capture this b2 pawn. So the pawn is pushed forward. White keeping an eye on these pawns now, watching his b4 pawn now with his queen. So more pressure is placed on this passed pawn here on b6. The rook, queen are both attacking. And what does white do? Move the queen to c4 here, where now if black captures white's queen, the pawn will just recapture, getting rid of this weakness of doubled pawns. So doubled pawns, that is another weakness you can have with your pawns. With one pawn in front of the other, the back pawn is slowed down by the pawn in front of it, and it can be a target, an easier target, as it's harder to move that pawn, and they kind of get in each other's way, especially the pawn in front blocks the pawn behind. All right, so this capture of the queen, which would help repair white's pawn structure here, that trade is avoided. The queen moves up here, and now we have queen and rook eyeing this pawn, and so a5 is just played, protecting this pawn. And if we look at the evaluation here, it's over +6.5 in white's favor, and here Polgar's opponent resigned, wishing, now the evaluation has jumped up over 7. So yes, white is just winning here. Black will not be able to stop these pawns from marching up, and then these weak pawns here as well on c6 and e6. So the theme of this game was to mind your p's and q's, your pawns and your queens. So watch your opponent's queen to see what it is doing. If you have opportunities to attack the queen and send it running, you may be able to obtain an advantage or even trap the queen. And also, just keep an eye on your pawns. Watch that your pawns are not just given away. Protect them. You can use them to gain space. And also try to avoid pawn weaknesses by creating too many islands, doubling your pawns. Try to avoid that. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed today's chess tip of minding your p's and q's, your pawns and queens. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions. And check out my Nick Butts Chess channel, where you can see more chess tips and enjoy more videos. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.